Breaking news emerging from West Africa as Captain Ibrahim Traoré officially declares that Burkina Faso will begin printing its own independent currency. Sources indicate that the reaction from Paris was immediate and hostile, with French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly delivering a chilling warning via a secure line: those who attempt such defiance end up in their graves. And Traore is next. This high-stakes confrontation reportedly took place barely 15 minutes after the conclusion of a landmark press briefing. Captain Traoré had addressed the global media corps at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, standing shoulder to shoulder with his finance minister and the newly appointed governor of Burkina Faso's inaugural sovereign central bank. The announcement was delivered with understated brevity, yet its geopolitical shockwaves have already begun to violently shake the foundations of the African continent. The military leader confirmed that Burkina Faso is initiating a full withdrawal from the CFA Franc zone to introduce a sovereign tender known as the Sankara. This new currency pays homage to Thomas Sankara, the legendary revolutionary icon who was brutally assassinated in 1987 for his bold attempts to sever ties with French monetary dominance. Analysts suggest this new tender represents far more than a shift in economic policy. It is being interpreted as an open declaration of war against what remains of French neo-colonial influence in Africa. As this critical geopolitical drama unfolds, we encourage viewers to engage with this report to help amplify the coverage of this developing story. We invite you to follow our broadcast for continuous updates and share your location in the discussion section to join the international conversation. For 3/4 of a century, a bloc of 14 African nations has been tethered to the CFA franc, a currency originally pegged to and patrolled by the French Treasury. Under this arrangement, virtually every printed banknote, every financial transaction, and every single economic maneuver has been filtered through the oversight of Paris. The French government mandates that these nations deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves into French vaults, effectively holding the keys to their ability to trade, invest, or develop independently. Economic historians estimate that this asymmetric system has siphoned upwards of $500 billion from the African economy over the last 7 decades. Critics describe it as the ultimate evolution of colonialism, territory controlled not by boots on the ground, but by central bankers manipulating the flow of capital. Now, 36-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré, presiding over one of the world's most resource-rich yet economically stifled nations, is attempting to shatter these historical chains. According to insider reports, the secure telecommunications line in his office rang moments after the live broadcast signal faded to black. The caller identification displayed a direct link to the Élysée Palace in Paris. Traoré activated the speaker, signaling his intelligence Chief Colonel Sankara and Dr. Ouedraogo, the Minister of Finance, to remain silent, ensuring there were high-ranking witnesses for the conversation that was about to transpire. President Macron's voice reportedly cut through the line in sharp, clipped French, stating he had just viewed the broadcast and was calling to issue a formal warning. He characterized the move as a catastrophic strategic error, to which President Traoré replied with a steady and composed demeanor. Traoré asserted that Burkina Faso exercising its monetary sovereignty is not an error but an inherent right, a claim that caused Macron's tone to harden significantly as he offered a grim history lesson on rights. He cited Muammar Gaddafi, noting the Libyan leader believed he had the right to establish a gold-backed African currency only to meet a violent end. He pointed to Laurent Gbagbo, who attempted to exit the CFA zone and subsequently spent 8 years imprisoned at The Hague, and invoked Thomas Sankara's desire for financial independence. Macron reminded him that Sankara was butchered by his own deputy, a man trained by French forces, making the underlying threat nakedly explicit. The implication was clear. France has historically neutralized every African head of state who dared to challenge the hegemony of the CFA franc, prompting Traoré to ask if he was being threatened with assassination. Traoré posed the question, directly ensuring the recording devices in the room captured every syllable of the exchange, which was followed by a heavy, pregnant pause. Macron, a seasoned diplomat, was too careful to issue a recorded death threat, pivoting instead to what he termed historical facts. He argued that leaders who destabilize the regional monetary order inevitably face severe consequences, insisting the CFA is the only guarantee of stability for West Africa. He warned that without it, the Burkinabe economy would implode within months, a claim Traore rejected, arguing their economy had been comatose for 70 years under the current system. The captain fired back, highlighting the absurdity of 50% of their national reserves sitting in Paris, generating wealth for French banks, while local hospitals lacked basic medicine. That is not stability. That is institutionalized theft. Traore declared, but Macron dismissed this as emotional rhetoric devoid of logic. The French president accused him of ignoring the technical complexities of running an independent central bank, such as managing inflation and ensuring currency stability. When told that Burkina Faso lacks the capacity, Traore vowed they would build that capacity or fail in the attempt. He famously added that it is better to fail as free men than to succeed as economic subjects, causing Macron's voice to drop to a chilling whisper. The French leader issued a strict ultimatum, 72 hours to reverse the decision, after which France would be compelled to take measures to safeguard the integrity of the CFA zone. Macron emphasized that those measures would be total, absolute, and irreversible, demanding confirmation that his message was understood. "I understand perfectly," Mr. President Traore replied, noting that Macron was threatening economic warfare because they dared to touch their own money. "The international community will also understand when I release this audio," Traore added just before the line went dead, leaving Colonel Sankara looking at his leader with deep concern. The colonel noted that a declaration of war had essentially just been issued, economic in nature, but war nonetheless, leaving Finance Minister Dr. Ouedraogo visibly shaken. The minister warned that Macron was not bluffing about the fallout, recalling how minor monetary reforms attempted by Côte d'Ivoire in 2010 resulted in France dismantling their economy in weeks using levers like banking sanctions, currency manipulation, and trade blockades. "I am aware," Traore acknowledged, quietly displaying a calm that belied the gravity of the situation. "That is precisely why we have spent the last 6 months in secret preparation. Bring me the contingency files." What the Burkinabe leadership did not know was that in Paris, mere minutes after the call ended, an emergency Security Council was already convening at the Élysée Palace, seated with the French finance minister. The gathering inside the Élysée Palace included the heavyweights of the French deep state, the director of the DGSE intelligence service, the governor of the Bank of France, and the administration's most senior strategists on African policy. The assessment from the intelligence chief was stark and unsettling. Traore is significantly more prepared than Muammar Gaddafi ever was. Our surveillance confirms that he has been quietly orchestrating alternative currency agreements with Beijing and Moscow for months, establishing a shadow banking infrastructure that is primed for immediate activation. This is not an impulsive act. It is a calculated geopolitical maneuver. The finance minister, visibly agitated, argued for an immediate and brutal counterattack, insisting they strike harder and faster. "I want a comprehensive sanctions regime ready for deployment within 24 hours, including a total trade embargo and the freezing of personal assets for every single government official." The goal is to inflict such severe economic pain that his own citizens rise up and demand his surrender. However, President Macron intervened, advocating for a more insidious long-term strategy. "If our retaliation is too obvious, we simply create a martyr." Traore is baiting us into a violent reaction so he can cast France as the imperialist villain. Instead, we must ensure his failure appears organic. We need an economic collapse that looks like the result of his own administrative incompetence, not our interference. The governor of the Bank of France nodded, signaling his agreement with the plan. "We maintain absolute control over the regional banking architecture. We can incrementally asphyxiate Burkina Faso's access to capital, framing the downturn as natural market jitters rather than political retribution. There must be no fingerprints left behind." Proceed with that plan, Macron commanded, but simultaneously prepare the kinetic options. If this subtle strangulation does not yield results within 2 weeks, we escalate to direct measures. Activate our deep contacts within the Burkinabe military establishment and determine if there are disgruntled officers prepared to step in and correct this mistake. The clandestine meeting that would effectively seal the fate of Burkina Faso concluded in less than 30 minutes. In that fleeting window of time, one of the world's most powerful nations resolved to crush one of its poorest solely for the crime of seeking sovereignty over its own treasury. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré was steeling himself for what he knew would be the existential fight of his life. The atmosphere within the presidential palace's strategy room was indistinguishable from a frontline military command center, because in reality, that is exactly what it had become. They were engaged in total economic warfare, a conflict demanding the same level of strategic foresight, intelligence gathering, and ruthless execution as a kinetic battle. "What is the status of the printing operations?" Captain Traoré demanded, pressing Dr. Ouedraogo for an update. The response was immediate. All systems are operational. The heavy machinery imported from Beijing arrived successfully last month, smuggled through customs under the guise of agricultural tractors. We are positioned to commence mass production of the banknotes tonight. The visual aesthetics and design elements have been finalized. The revolutionary icon Thomas Sankara is featured prominently on the primary denominations, flanked by symbols of Burkina Faso heritage and integrated with security protocols that rival Euro standards. We utilize the expertise of the same Swiss consultancy firm that handles currency minting for multiple European monetary systems. Regarding the reserves, we currently hold 3 tons of gold in the central vault, with an additional 5 tons being discreetly acquired through brokerage networks in Dubai. While this falls short of total coverage, it provides sufficient collateral to safeguard the currency's legitimacy during the critical launch phase. Colonel Sankara interrupted the briefing with an urgent security update. Chief intelligence reports indicate irregular maneuvering by French military units stationed in the border states. It does not appear to be an active declaration of war yet, but they are forward-deploying assets within striking distance of Ouagadougou. Traoré acknowledged the report with a grim nod. A conventional direct invasion is off the table. It is too transparent and would trigger a global diplomatic firestorm. Their playbook will likely involve sponsoring a regime change or manufacturing civil chaos to justify a so-called stabilization mission. We must ramp up every defensive measure immediately. I need our most loyal battalion deployed to secure the minting facility, the bullion vaults, and all key utility infrastructure. Consider it executed, sir. But Ibrahim, we must confront the true Achilles heel, the regional financial grid. Precisely. The moment the Sankara currency goes live, cross-border commerce with the CFA bloc becomes a logistical nightmare. Paris holds the administrative keys to the transaction architecture. They possess the capability to sever our financial lifeline with a single keystroke. This specific technical hurdle has crushed every prior attempt at monetary sovereignty. The CFA was never designed as merely a currency. It functions as a comprehensive, totalizing financial ecosystem. The entire infrastructure, banking, software, payment gateways, and trade protocols was engineered to ensure French dominance. Breaking free necessitates reconstructing the wheel while under fire. This is where our strategic allies intervene. Traoré noted projecting a complex schematic onto the main display. Beijing has committed to supplying an alternative payment backbone, utilizing their cross-border interbank payment system. Moscow is also tabling their SPFS network to serve as a redundancy measure for our transactions. Simultaneously, we are deeply engaged in talks with Turkey, India, and various Latin American states to forge direct bilateral trade pacts that completely circumvent the CFA mechanism. Will these measures truly suffice? I cannot make promises, but remaining shackled to the CFA guarantees eternal destitution. This path offers a legitimate fighting chance. Dr. Ouedraogo gave voice to the apprehension filling the room. So 5 African heads of state have attempted this path before. All 5 ended up in graves or prison cells. What convinces you that you will prevail where they crumbled? Traoré let the silence hang heavy in the air before answering. They failed because they moved in isolation. By the time Gaddafi targeted the petrodollar, he was already sequestered from the global community. Gbagbo lacked heavyweight allies in his corner. Sankara faced internal treachery. But we stand together. Mali and Niger are monitoring these events intently. We have our neighbors. If we successfully break through this wall, they will follow suit. Guinea has already signaled their intent to join us. We are building a coalition meant to last, not walking willingly into a death trap. But make no mistake, even if Paris decides to eliminate me, the revolution will not die with me. This is precisely why we have locked the strategy into law. We have constructed robust institutions designed to outlast any single commander, ensuring continuity regardless of who sits in the chair. The issue has transcended my personal safety entirely. We are talking about tearing down an exploitative machine that has kept 14 sovereign nations under its boot for 75 years. Paris fired the first shots of its economic warfare as the sun came up the next day, executing a strategy that was as quiet as it was destructive. Local banks in Burkina Faso, which depend on French digital infrastructure for international movements, suddenly started hitting unexplained technical walls. Transaction speeds crawled to a halt. Accounts were locked down under the guise of routine compliance checks, while essential credit documents for imports were rejected due to supposed paperwork errors. On paper, absolutely no one linked these sudden hurdles to our announcement about the new currency. To an outsider, it looked like standard financial procedure. However, the synchronization was too perfect, and the devastating consequences were felt immediately. In just 48 hours, local businesses found themselves completely paralyzed, unable to pay for goods coming in from abroad. Oil shipments sat rotting at docks in Ivory Coast because payment promises would not process. Vital shipments of European medicine were cancelled outright when the money simply vanished in the ether. Even money sent home by hardworking citizens abroad was caught in the dragnet, flagged by sudden stricter security algorithms. The country's financial engine started to sputter and stall, deprived of liquidity. From the nerve center of the central bank, Captain Traore watched the crisis unfold on the screens. Displays flashed with live data, showing blocked wires, frozen assets, and a rising tide of panic coming from the private business community. The attack from Paris was sophisticated and ruthless. It disguised targeted aggression as mere bureaucratic incompetence, hiding the malice behind a mask of error. It is undeniable skill in statecraft, Colonel Sankara admitted with a grim expression. There is no direct proof, nothing to point back to the Élysée Palace. Just the currency network conveniently failing, but only when it concerns Burkina Faso traffic. That settles it. We must accelerate the timeline for the backup system, Traore ordered sharply. Dr. Ouedraogo, bring the Chinese transaction system online right now. I want it working by sunrise. But so the tech team planned for a 2-week integration phase. We do not have the luxury of 14 days. The French are choking the life out of our market as we speak. Each 24-hour period of delay destroys our merchants and turns the people against our cause. We flip the switch at dawn. The Minister of Finance agreed, though clearly hesitant. I will command it, but be prepared for disorder. The system will crash, stall, and confuse everyone. I would rather be free in a storm than a slave in calm waters. Do it. Later that night, the captain took to the airwaves to speak directly to the nation. He knew Paris was counting on confusion, hoping the people would blame their own government's ineptitude for the financial turbulence. He needed to expose the truth immediately before the lies took root in the public consciousness. Citizens of our homeland, he began speaking with the raw honesty that had endeared him to the masses. For the past 48 hours, you have suffered through blocked banking services and the inability to receive money from your families overseas. Some are whispering that this pain is the cost of our decision to create our own money. Let me tell you what is actually happening. He held up a detailed chart mapping out exactly where and how the transactions were being stopped. These systematic failures started precisely 4 hours after we announced our new path. They affect only us, even though we share the exact same banking system with 13 other African countries. The technical paralysis manifests only when Burkinabe capital is on the line. This is not bad luck. This is not the market fluctuating. This is France using its control over our digital infrastructure to punish us for daring to be free. They are taking your daily bread hostage to force your leadership to surrender. He stared intensely into the lens. It is vital that you understand how this colonial currency system truly functions. Picture this. You put your wages in the bank and 50% of it is immediately wired to the French treasury. Paris takes that capital, invests it globally, and keeps every cent of the profit. You see nothing. Your nation sees nothing. Your labor builds skyscrapers in Europe while our capital struggles to survive. And when we want to buy hospitals or tractors, we must ask their permission. If we attempt to trade directly with Asian powers, French intermediaries step in to block the deal or take a fee off the top. They can say no to our economic growth. That is not freedom. It is old-fashioned conquest disguised as modern banking. As he spoke, the internet caught fire. Clips of the speech went viral, instantly dominating timelines from South Africa to the global south. Traore was betting that exposing the scheme would paralyze his enemies. By tomorrow morning, he announced, we will be operating on a new financial system. We are integrating with payment grids from China, Russia, and Turkey, creating a mix that ensures no one country can ever control us again. This transition will be rough. There will be errors, there will be delays. Breaking chains is never painless, but these problems will be ours to solve for our own benefit. I ask for your endurance. I ask for your trust. And in return, I promise you this: never again will we beg a stranger for the right to use our own money. The reaction from the street was nothing short of a double-edged sword, presenting a complex tapestry of emotion. You had massive throngs of people flooding the avenues, their voices raised in a deafening chorus, demanding liberty and absolute self-determination. However, the counter-reaction was equally vociferous and could not be ignored. Citizens were absolutely furious over frozen assets, while small business owners found themselves completely paralyzed by the gridlock, unable to conduct basic commerce. The financial sting was beginning to bite, and it was biting hard. It became increasingly clear that Paris's economic chokehold was highly effective, even as the details of their geopolitical maneuvering were brought into the light. Meanwhile, back in the corridors of power in France, the crisis room was buzzing with frenetic energy. The head of intelligence made absolutely no secret of his growing annoyance with the deteriorating situation. Traore is evolving from a nuisance into a major strategic headache. He's going viral across the globe, successfully painting us as imperial tyrants. And let us be honest, in this context, we are acting like imperial tyrants. The finance minister shot back immediately, noting that at least where the money is concerned, the accusation holds water. However, he emphasized that they have played this geopolitical game with finesse for over 70 years. This soldier is forcing our operations out into the open, and that transparency threatens the entire established racket we have maintained for generations. President Macron pored over the intelligence reports flooding in from across the continent, from Kenya and Tanzania, all the way to South Africa. Heads of state were quietly cheering for Ouagadougou, seeing reflections of their own struggles in this fight. The consensus was grim. If Traoré actually pulled this off, the foundation of the entire French monetary empire in Africa could begin to crumble. We have to turn the screws tighter, Macron concluded decisively. Putting boots on the ground is off the table. That is too crude for this era. Instead, we're going to hit them where it hurts most, right in the wallet. I want the economic pain to be absolute and unrelenting. Give me a total trade embargo immediately. I want something far more severe than just minor banking hiccups or delays. Cut off all French exports to Burkina Faso and block absolutely everything coming out of the country. Furthermore, lean heavily on the European Union to follow suit and join the blockade. When an aide cautioned that the world would view this as petty revenge, the reply was cold and calculating: let them see. Real power is about demonstrating the catastrophic cost of defiance. We need to break Burkina Faso publicly so the neighboring states do not get brave enough to try the same thing. But in their arrogance, Paris missed one crucial detail. Traoré saw this move coming from miles away. He had a wild card tucked up his sleeve, an asymmetric counterattack specifically designed to target France's weak spot. This counter-move was the debut of the Burkina Sankara note, officially launched at the stroke of midnight to coincide with Liberation Day. As the clock struck 12, fresh bills began rolling off the production lines at a highly classified secret site located near the capital. Every single denomination bore the face of Thomas Sankara with the phrase "economic independence" inscribed in local tongues. The message sent to the populace was absolutely electric. Sankara, who died for resisting Paris, was effectively resurrected on the very tender that embodied his vision. Yet as powerful as icons are, they do not buy grain or calm the nerves of furious merchants. The true acid test was whether this new financial plumbing could actually handle the massive transactional load of a nation's economy. Dr. Ouedraogo ran point on the technical integration from the central command, overseeing every minute detail of the transition. Teams of Chinese experts worked shoulder to shoulder with local engineers racing against the clock to squash bugs and patch code. A complex setup meant for a 2-year rollout was going live in just 18 hours. Run the first test was the order from the gallery. Processing now. It is a transfer from a local firm to a Chinese vendor for agricultural machinery. Routing through the cross-border interbank system. French servers are totally cut out of the loop. Eyes were glued to the monitors as the digital packets traversed the new grid. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30. Finally, the screen flashed transaction verified. The technician shouted, "Funds cleared, 0 errors." The command center exploded with applause. It was just one payment, but it was the definitive proof of concept they needed. In the following hours, they pushed through dozens of transfers, facilitating the purchase of Turkish fabrics, Indian medicine, and Russian energy supplies. It wasn't all seamless, of course. Systems crashed intermittently, digital queues formed, and clients were understandably baffled by the new protocols. But the economic engine was running. By dawn, the nation had successfully cleared over 500 global payments on the new rails. The French monopoly was officially obsolete. Traore convened a press briefing armed with hard evidence of their success. As of today, Burkina Faso stands on its own 2 feet regarding global finance. We are dealing with the world directly. No permission slips are needed from Paris anymore. The CFA stranglehold is shattered. He displayed a crisp new Sankara bill for the cameras. This is what actual freedom looks like. This is not rhetoric, and it is not a hypothesis. This is real currency printed on our soil, managed by our people, and serving our national agenda. To the merchants who are worried about the shift, hear me clearly. Yes, the new pipes are rusty. Yes, the transition hurts right now. But we improve daily. Every deal we close strengthens our economic backbone. Give it a few months, and this will be routine business. And soon you will ask why we ever let strangers hold our wallet in the first place. Yet even as the president marked the win, Paris was loading its biggest gun. The retaliatory statement was issued by Brussels, but the fingerprints on the document were undeniably French. Citing risks of fiscal volatility and illicit financial flows, the European Union announced it is enacting total commercial sanctions on Burkina Faso, pending the restoration of previously recognized banking protocols. They cloaked the aggression in technical jargon about safety standards and regulatory compliance. In reality, it was a modern siege. Europe was locking the gates tight. No European Union firm was permitted to do business with Ouagadougou. No Western bank would touch their money. The diaspora found themselves unable to send cash to their families. It was total, unmitigated economic warfare. This was warfare waged not with guns and bombs, but with red tape and regulations. The fallout was instant and absolutely savage. Europe had historically been Burkina Faso's biggest buyer. Then in the blink of an eye, the doors slammed shut. Massive cotton piles that fed thousands of families suddenly sat rotting with no buyers. Even gold, the nation's main source of hard cash, was being turned away by European refineries refusing to process the metal. The economic squeeze went from a slow burn to a raging wildfire. Joblessness skyrocketed, shops were boarded up across the city, and the state treasury effectively ran dry. President Ibrahim Traoré was confronting the most critical juncture of his administration to date. The briefing hall was charged with tension, packed to capacity with aggressive journalists and panicked captains of industry. One reporter shouted above the din, "Mr. President, 3,000 workers were laid off in just the last 7 days because Europe has nullified our trade contracts." A business owner interrupted, demanding answers. "How do you justify this, sir? My enterprise is facing insolvency because the European Union has completely locked me out of the market. What is your strategy here, Mr. President?" The word on the street is that the era of the CFA franc looked like paradise compared to the financial ruin we are experiencing right now. What do you have to say to them? Traore tightened his grip on the lectern, visibly bearing the heavy burden of every pink slip issued, every shuttered storefront, and every household gasping for economic air. This turmoil was precisely the scenario political observers believe France had orchestrated to drive a wedge between the populace and their commander. The objective was to frame national monetary sovereignty as an act of financial self-destruction. "You want to know my message to those who are suffering?" The president began, his voice remaining rock steady. "I tell you, this I see you. I acknowledge that you are in pain, and I take full responsibility for that. However, I need you to understand the macro-level game that is actually playing out against us. Do not be fooled. Europe is not restricting our access because of market volatility or breaches of banking protocols. They have imposed a blockade, because Paris is enraged that we dared to assert control over our own currency. They are weaponizing your hunger to force us into submission. He gestured to his aide Taz to display a statistical graphic on the monitor behind him. These are the compliance standards that Europe claims we have violated. But if you look closer, you will see that Burkina Faso actually matches or beats these metrics. Our protocols against money laundering are actually tighter than those of several European Union member states. Our financial transparency surpasses even the Swiss banking system. So why are we being sanctioned? It has nothing to do with the rules. This is entirely about dominance. It is France demonstrating the consequences that befall an African nation that decides to say, enough is enough. Now you stand before a decision not as partisans of a specific party, but as patriots of this land. Do we surrender our sovereignty just to stop the immediate pain? Do we crawl back to the CFA system, allowing foreign powers to hold our wallet and dictate our future? Or do we endure this trial pivot toward new markets, forge fresh alliances, and emerge on the other side truly free? Suddenly, a woman in the press corps rose to her feet. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she spoke. "Mr. President, I desire freedom. I believe in the mission. But my children need a meal today, not in some hypothetical future. How am I supposed to feed them when the closure of European markets has destroyed my job?" Traore received that question as if it were a physical blow to the chest. It highlighted the brutal arithmetic of modern geopolitics. It was a stark reminder of real citizens facing real starvation in real time. "Sister, I do not possess a magic wand," he confessed somberly. "But I can make you this promise. Beginning tomorrow morning, we are rolling out an emergency relief package that includes direct cash transfers to the households most severely hit by this blockade. We are introducing subsidized prices for staple foods and medicine alongside retraining initiatives for industries that bypass European trade routes entirely. Is this sufficient? No. Will it solve every problem? Certainly not. But it serves as a critical lifeline while we construct a new economic path." He scanned the room, observing a complex mixture of anger, exhaustion, and a grudging respect for his unvarnished bluntness. "I will not deceive you by promising an easy road ahead. France possesses deep pockets and financial weapons of mass destruction. We, however, possess grit and the truth. They may be winning the economic war today, but we are fighting for the very soul of this nation. And that is a far more significant cause." The conference concluded with the tension still thick in the air, but at least Traoré had leveled with them instead of selling fantasies. As the cameras cut away, Colonel Sankara approached with a grim intelligence update. French intelligence services are highly active, with signals intelligence chatter suggesting they have given the green light for a coup d'etat. They have compromised officers within our ranks who are panicking over the economy. The timeline is tight days, perhaps mere weeks. They are moving fast to exploit the chaos. Traoré was not surprised. History showed that every African statesman who dared to challenge the Franc eventually faced a gun-direct intervention or a proxy rebellion. Gaddafi, Gbagbo, Sankara, all were removed from power when financial strangulation failed to break them. "What is our defense status?" Traoré asked. "We have quarantined the unstable units and positioned loyalist forces at key choke points. We have beefed up security at strategic hubs. However, if Paris is running the show, they are supplying intelligence logistics and possibly even boots on the ground. We have to assume they know our defensive layout. Then we flip the script," Traoré decided firmly. "If a coup is cooking, we will expose it to the public before it can boil over." "Do we possess hard proof?" The colonel replied, "We have some intercepts, sir, but no smoking gun as of yet. They are carefully covering their tracks. Find that smoking gun. I want undeniable evidence of French plotting on my desk. Lean on every intelligence asset we have available. Loop in the Chinese and Russians. They possess the technology to see what we cannot, and they want us to win. If we get the proof, we will broadcast it globally before the first shot is fired. Make it absolute political suicide for France to proceed with this operation. They cannot pull strings in the dark if the entire world is watching the puppeteer." Traoré was initiating a full-scale information counterstrike. Instead of waiting to be toppled, he intended to leak the details of the plot and rally the world before the tanks could roll. It was a gamble with incredibly high stakes. If his assessment was incorrect, he would appear paranoid. If he was right but could not prove it, he would be revealing his hand too early. However, remaining passive was a guaranteed death sentence. The shadow war kicked into high gear as Burkina's agents, backed by Russian training and Chinese tech, began mapping the conspiracy network. They flagged the compromised officers, tracked the illicit wire transfers, and intercepted the encrypted calls. Meanwhile, the French Directorate General for External Security was running its own game, aggressively hunting for cracks in the regime's defenses. Sources close to the administration reveal that opposition forces had deeply infiltrated the president's security apparatus, actively searching for vulnerabilities to exploit for a planned regime change. This was the very definition of clandestine operations. However, with the future of the nation's economic independence hanging in the balance, an unforeseen variable completely altered the strategic landscape. Reports indicate that a high-ranking French intelligence asset stationed in neighboring Côte d'Ivoire to coordinate the destabilization efforts committed a critical operational error. The agent transmitted an encrypted communique back to headquarters in Paris, utilizing a communication frequency that Chinese counterintelligence had reportedly compromised several months earlier. The resulting intercepted data provided a comprehensive and devastatingly detailed roadmap of the entire conspiracy. It contained the complete operational schematic for the coup d'état, a list of compromised military personnel, the precise time frame for the assault logistical supply chains, and most damning of all, authorization orders, tracing directly back to the highest office in France. Colonel Sankara reportedly entered the presidential suite with urgency, presenting a stack of documents. He confirmed they had secured irrefutable proof of the foreign plot, including decrypted messages and financial transaction records. President Traoré reviewed the intelligence, a moment described by insiders as a chilling mix of vindication and the realization of imminent danger. His suspicions were confirmed. The former colonial power was indeed seeking his removal. The challenge now shifted to a high-stakes diplomatic chess match, utilizing this intelligence to neutralize the threat without precipitating a chaotic international incident. While the raw data was conclusive for intelligence professionals, the administration recognized the necessity of translating these technical details into a narrative the general public could easily grasp. Technical intercepts and coded cables are complex. Converting them into a clear, compelling story for the ordinary citizen requires a different approach entirely. The strategy involved refining the presentation. Dr. Ouedraogo was instructed to assemble the nation's most capable communication strategists to manage the information release. The goal was to construct a report so watertight that even international media outlets would be unable to refute it. The president demanded precise chronology, specific identities, financial amounts, and undeniable connections to the French leadership. The timeline for release was set at 72 hours. This interval provided crucial time to fortify their legal arguments, warn strategic partners, and plan the dissemination to maximize the geopolitical impact. The plan called for a simultaneous information saturation across all platforms, social media networks, traditional print journalism, television broadcasts, and official diplomatic channels. Colonel Sankara, visibly frustrated by the delay, questioned the strategy. He argued that since the enemy was already compromised, they should allow the plotters to proceed and be caught in the act. President Traoré countered that the objective was not merely to embarrass the French government. His priority was to dismantle the coup attempt while maintaining a pathway for future diplomatic relations. He reasoned that an immediate public exposure would corner President Macron, potentially forcing him to escalate hostilities to preserve his political standing. By issuing a private ultimatum, Traoré offered his counterpart a chance to cancel the operation discreetly. It was a strategic off-ramp for both leaders. The ultimate goal remains monetary sovereignty, not the total collapse of Franco-African relations. A tactical retreat allows for eventual reconciliation, whereas public humiliation would permanently destroy diplomatic ties. This decision represented a pragmatic calculation, balancing the moral high ground against the pragmatic necessity of regime survival. The strategy was to apply just enough pressure to stop the attack without making peace impossible. The subsequent secure telephone conversation with the French president was described as brief and intensely cold. President Traoré initiated the call by formally stating his purpose to inform the Élysée that his government had uncovered a coordinated conspiracy to topple his administration. He specified that they possessed tangible evidence of the Directorate General for External Security's orchestration of the plot, including communications directly authorized by the French president's office. There was a profound silence on the line before President Macron responded, his voice reportedly controlled and deliberate. When Macron characterized the statement as a serious allegation, Traoré corrected him, asserting it was a documented fact. The Burkina Faso leader listed his evidence, the operational timeline, the agents involved, and the wire transfers, all proving that French intelligence was manufacturing a regime change solely to punish the nation's move toward financial independence. When asked for his demands, Traoré was blunt: an immediate cancellation of the coup and the total withdrawal of all intelligence assets involved. He demanded a complete severance of ties with the local conspirators. In exchange for shutting down the operation, the incriminating file would remain classified, sparing Paris global embarrassment and a diplomatic crisis. Traoré indicated a willingness to discuss normalizing relations in the future, provided that France accepted that the issue of national currency sovereignty was non-negotiable. However, he issued a stern warning: refusal would result in the total release of the dossier within 72 hours, exposing every memo and recording that implicated France in using assassination squads to suppress African independence. He emphasized that such a revelation would completely destroy the French president's international reputation. Furthermore, it would render the CFA franc politically toxic, likely inspiring other nations to follow suit, thereby causing the French sphere of influence in Africa to disintegrate. President Macron hesitated, questioning the veracity of the claim. In response, Traoré offered to quote the specific directives from the French leader's own correspondence. He cited a specific dispatch in which the president had personally authorized decisive measures to restore what was termed monetary stability. Traoré noted that this phrase was merely a diplomatic euphemism for a coup d'état. Another heavy silence followed as the implications weighed on the administration in Paris. The French leadership had to rapidly assess the situation. Was this a bluff? Or did Ouagadougou truly possess evidence damaging enough to cause a political catastrophe? Eventually, President Macron broke the silence, stating simply that this conversation had never occurred. He added that any leak would be dismissed as foreign disinformation, yet the underlying threat remained clear. Traoré reiterated the deadline: 72 hours to abort the mission. President Traoré terminated the call before any further retort could be made, his composure giving way to a slight tremor in his hands. He had just engaged in a direct confrontation with a leader of the G7 nations, threatened to dismantle a major Western intelligence network, and initiated a countdown with unpredictable consequences. Colonel Sankara observed that the move was either a brilliant geopolitical maneuver or a suicidal gamble. Traoré acknowledged the risk, but noted that the decision now rested entirely with Paris. The French president faced a binary choice: launch an operation that was already compromised or swallow his pride. If they proceeded, the administration was prepared to release the full data set and appeal to the international community. Traoré confided that his strategy relied heavily on the French leader's sense of pragmatism and political self-preservation. Ultimately, the cost of a failed, publicly exposed coup far outweighed the loss of control over a currency. The following 72 hours would feel like a lifetime as they waited for the response. Behind the scenes, the bureaucratic machinery of the French covert apparatus continued to grind on churning out logistics and authorization for wire transfers. Technically, the plot remained a go. Despite the ultimatum, yet subtle fractures were beginning to undermine the operation as missions were quietly scrubbed and key assets were suddenly rotated out of the field. These movements hinted that a ferocious internal power struggle was unfolding within Paris regarding their next step, while President Traoré wasted no time in fortifying his position on the board. Special forces units established a perimeter around critical national infrastructure, and the central mint was secured with a level of intensity reserved for a fortress under siege. International partners stood ready to issue scathing condemnations the instant the first shot was fired. But when the deadline finally arrived, it passed into history with nothing but silence. There were no armored columns in the streets yet. At the 74th hour, Captain Traoré received the verification he needed. The immediate threat had been effectively neutralized. Operatives belonging to French intelligence services were observed initiating a discreet withdrawal, extracting themselves from the active theater of operations. The local military officers they had compromised were notified that their objectives were suspended indefinitely, marking a significant tactical triumph for Traoré. However, rather than resting on this win, the leader chose to execute an audacious strategic pivot by deciding to release the intelligence to the public regardless. He did not dump the entire raw file, but rather released enough hard evidence to validate that the danger was authentic, holding a press briefing that immediately seized the attention of the global community. During the presentation, Traoré laid out a meticulously curated selection of classified documents that mapped out the orchestration of the French-backed offensive. He displayed sanitized communication logs that corroborated the conspiracy without endangering his own sources, alongside financial ledgers that detailed specific payoffs made to collaborators. In what was perhaps the most explosive revelation, he played an audio recording featuring an agent from the DGSE. The tape captured the foreign operative actively coordinating the details of the assault with a compromised member of the Burkina Faso military. "Commander, I do not share this to shame Paris," Traoré clarified with a steady demeanor, but to illustrate the stark reality that African nations confront when they attempt to pursue genuine autonomy. He pointed out that mere days after declaring monetary independence, their economy was placed under siege, and only weeks later, a coup attempt was already being engineered. This is the heavy price required to defy the CFA infrastructure. He noted, while simultaneously confirming that this particular subversion plot had been scrapped. "The traitorous officers are currently facing justice," he continued, "and yet I am extending a diplomatic olive branch to France." He argued that if they recognized Burkina Faso's right to control its own money, a partnership could be forged rooted in mutual esteem, rather than the outdated model of colonial oversight. This disclosure completely shifted the geopolitical narrative, and notably the usual chorus of Western criticism directed at the military government fell silent. Most foreign capitals, acknowledging the complexity of the situation, chose to remain on the sidelines rather than intervene. But on the streets across Africa, the revelation ignited a political firestorm, with demonstrators swarming French diplomatic missions throughout the continent. Demands to totally dismantle the CFA. Franc grew louder, validating Traoré's belief that French financial hegemony was not untouchable and could be challenged. By withstanding economic strangulation and attempts at regime change, he had effectively shattered the long-held myth of the system's invincibility. Within a matter of weeks, the government in Bamako announced it was launching a formal assessment into the feasibility of its own monetary autonomy. Simultaneously, officials in Abuja initiated similar strategic discussions, while the leadership in Conakry signaled its intention to align with this new direction. The financial architecture that France had enforced for 75 years was displaying fatal structural fractures, yet Traoré harbored no illusions about the future. He understood that the conflict had merely shifted phases, and that Paris would inevitably regroup, identifying new pressure points to try and roll back Burkina Faso's independence. Sanctions remained in place, and the immense logistical nightmare of managing a sovereign currency was only just commencing. 6 months following the official launch of the Sankara currency, the national leadership gathered to evaluate the economic landscape. The new tender was in circulation, though the transition was turbulent, with inflation biting harder than anticipated and hovering near 20% annually. Exchange rates were fluctuating far more than the central bank desired, and cross-border commerce faced friction despite the creation of alternative clearinghouses. Nevertheless, the money was tangible, it was real, and it was actively changing hands within the economy. Local commerce was adjusting to the new reality, and critically, the nation's wealth was no longer stockpiled in Paris, generating yield for French institutions. However, the economic reality remained grim as European embargoes continued to inflict pain on the country. Unemployment rates were elevated, and many shops had closed, proving that the price of sovereignty was being paid by ordinary citizens. Yet, this isolation from the West forced the discovery of new horizons, proving that necessity is indeed the mother of unexpected alliances. Investment capital from China and India began to flow into the country to bridge the gap. Where European corporations saw a blockade aggressive, Turkish entrepreneurs saw a market vacuum and moved swiftly to fill the void left by fleeing French entities. A robust non-Western commercial network was taking shape, but more importantly, the crisis supercharged the drive for regional unity. Mali and Niger were working in lockstep with Burkina Faso, pooling resources for payment infrastructure and presenting a united front in trade negotiations. What had begun as a solitary act of defiance was rapidly evolving into a broader pan-African crusade. Then came the phone call, an occurrence that was becoming a familiar trope in these late-night shifts that altered the geopolitical trajectory. This time, however, the line did not trace back to Moscow or Paris. It originated from Lagos, Nigeria. President Traore, this is Sanusi Lamido. Sanusi, the voice on the other end, announced identifying himself as the former governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. I am contacting you today to broach a strategic development that possesses the potential to fundamentally reshape the entire landscape of West African financial sovereignty. Captain Traoré sat up straighter, his posture stiffening with interest. Sanusi was a true titan in the realm of African finance, a figure who commanded a mastery over the complex mechanics of central banking as well as the unforgiving realities of statecraft. Please continue, Traoré urged, his voice steady and attentive. Nigeria has been monitoring your bold experiment with intense scrutiny, analyzing every obstacle you faced, the circumventive measures you employed, and the ultimate balance sheet of your liberation. I am on this line to notify you that Abuja is currently weighing a monumental strategic pivot, one that would see us steer decisively away from the Western financial sphere. A sudden rush of adrenaline coursed through the president's veins at the revelation. It was impossible to overstate the stakes. Nigeria stood as the undisputed economic engine of the region, a powerhouse armed with 200 million citizens and vast untapped petroleum reserves. If a giant of that magnitude were to throw its full geopolitical weight behind the breakaway movement, it would effectively deliver a fatal terminal strike to the lingering dominance of French monetary policy. That move would fundamentally overturn the entire geopolitical chessboard, Traoré stated, carefully measuring each word. With Nigeria aligning its forces against the established CFA framework, Paris would see its iron grip evaporate. The entire colonial financial architecture would face total implosion. Precisely, Sanusi concurred, his tone grave. However, it is imperative that we glean lessons from your precedent. What tactics yielded success? Where did you falter? What strategies would you revise given a second chance? Traoré paused, taking a moment to calibrate his answer. This moment presented a critical opportunity to transmit battle-tested wisdom insights that could safeguard his allies from replicating the painful missteps of the past. Rule number 1 is absolute no half measures. In the beginning, we made the error of attempting to maintain vestigial ties with the old establishment while simultaneously constructing the new order. That indecision merely spawned chaos and provided France with structural vulnerabilities to exploit. You are required to sever the umbilical cord entirely and commit 100% to the alternative architecture. Secondly, ensure your independent infrastructure is fully operational and live before you ever publicly declare your intentions. We had Russian and Chinese payment rails positioned on standby, yet we discovered too late that we lacked sufficient strategic depth. You require multiple layers of redundancy, for rest assured the adversary will relentlessly hammer away at your most fragile point of connectivity. Thirdly, you must internalize that the political campaign, the narrative warfare, is just as critical to survival as the technical monetary engineering. We may have secured the technical victory, and our currency circulates, but the fierce battle for the hearts and minds of the public remains an ongoing struggle. He could practically hear the sound of Sanusi scribbling notes on the other end. And regarding the social toll, your unemployment figures spiked by 20% within the first 6 months. They did indeed, Traoré admitted with a heavy sigh. That is the burden that denies you sleep, the knowledge that your policies are inflicting genuine pain upon families, even if the ultimate destination is liberty. However, here is the crucial lesson. If you are transparent about the sacrifices, if you implement measures to cushion the economic fall, and if you demonstrate tangible victories, the populace will weather the storm for the sake of national dignity. We immediately rolled out direct cash assistance programs to support those most severely impacted by the sanctions. We launched comprehensive vocational training for emerging economic sectors and heavily subsidized basic staples. While it did not entirely erase the hardship, it was sufficient to maintain the political line and prevent unrest. And now, 6 months down the line, we can confidently say we have navigated through the most turbulent part of the storm. The new payment infrastructures are proving resilient and holding steady. Fresh trade routes are fully active, and the inflation rate is finally beginning to cool off. We may not be swimming in surplus wealth just yet, but we are standing firmly on our own 2 feet, a truly revolutionary feat for any African nation in this climate. Sanusi hesitated for a brief moment before posing the ultimate philosophical question. Was the struggle truly worth the heavy cost? Traore gazed out from the window of his office, taking in the sprawling city lights of Ouagadougou as they flickered in the night. He was acutely aware that out there in the dark, some families were still struggling, losing their livelihoods as a direct result of the hard choices he had been forced to make. Yet simultaneously, others were clocking into shifts at newly established manufacturing plants funded by Chinese capital, paid with bills printed right here on home soil rather than in Paris. Ask me that question again in 5 years, he replied with resolve. But know this, my conviction stands unshaken. Any generation raised in an environment of financial independence is far better positioned to construct lasting true wealth than one that resigns itself to the shackles of monetary colonialism. Once the line went dead, an immense wave of potential washed over Traore. If a giant like Nigeria truly embraced the drive for currency independence, it would undoubtedly ignite an unstoppable chain reaction. The other major African markets would inevitably fall in line. The antiquated CFA structure would simply collapse under the crushing pressure of its own weight. However, he was well aware of the reality that Paris would not simply roll over and accept defeat. Losing influence over Nigeria meant they would fight tooth and nail to maintain their grip and prevent others from defecting. The conflict was rapidly shifting gears into a higher stakes arena. 3 weeks following that conversation, the geopolitical temperature heated up with alarming speed. The Nigerian president took to the national airwaves, announcing a sweeping, comprehensive audit of the nation's financial alliances, specifically targeting its historic links to the CFA bloc while exploring independent currency options. To be clear, this was not yet an official exit strategy from the CFA system. Although Nigeria had never been a full member state, despite maintaining tight relations, this served as a crystal-clear message. Africa's economic titan was openly siding with the sovereignty coalition. Paris reacted instantly and with predictable fury. Within a matter of hours, French diplomats were sitting down with Nigerian leadership issuing stark, ominous warnings about the potential fallout. The formidable French press machine kicked into high gear, spinning elaborate narratives that framed the concept of monetary freedom as nothing short of economic suicide. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, intelligence agencies in Paris began aggressively probing Nigeria's structural weak points. But for the first time, France had hit an immovable wall. Nigeria was simply too massive to intimidate in the same manner they had pressured smaller nations like Burkina Faso. With a population of 200 million citizens and vast oil reserves at its disposal, Nigeria possessed the resilience to weather whatever sanctions Europe might threaten. The administration had already secured eager purchasers across Asian markets, established sophisticated alternative payment networks for crude oil shipments, and possessed the financial fortitude necessary to resist French diplomatic pressure. For the first time in modern history, the Élysée Palace found itself confronting the terrifying prospect of its monetary dominion in Africa crumbling before its very eyes. This crisis did not stem from a battlefield loss or an economic collapse, but rather because African states simply chose to walk away from a financial system they viewed as fundamentally rigged against them. President Traoré watched these developments unfold with a complex mixture of validation and deep anxiety. Validation that his audacious strategy was triggering a continent-wide awakening. However, that satisfaction was tempered by the gnawing fear that Paris might retaliate with a ferocity previously unseen in diplomatic circles. Those worst fears were realized the moment Colonel Sankara burst into the Situation Room, clutching urgent intelligence reports indicating that they had successfully intercepted high-level encrypted communications. The decrypted data suggested that French authorities were orchestrating a massive offensive that far exceeded standard economic sanctions or rumors of regime change. They have officially designated this initiative as Operation Permanent Solution, and while the operational specifics remain opaque, the language used suggests an intent to make a devastating example of the administration. The objective appears to be an outcome of such brutality that it would effectively deter any other African nation from ever attempting to follow in their footsteps. A cold realization washed over Traoré as he contemplated whether this meant targeted airstrikes or a catastrophe of even greater magnitude. The intercepted dialogues frequently mentioned total destabilization and irreversible consequences, and, although the precise hour remains unknown, military assets are undoubtedly already in motion. French garrisons in neighboring territories have moved to their highest alert status, while intelligence operatives are reportedly flooding the region, signaling that a major event is on the horizon. Wasting absolutely no time, Traoré issued immediate orders to establish a secure line with President Putin and to summon the Chinese ambassador for an emergency meeting. If Paris was indeed mobilizing for a kinetic conflict, their geopolitical allies needed to be fully briefed and prepared to intervene. The subsequent dialogue with the Kremlin was notably direct. President Putin intelligence indicates that the French government is on the verge of executing a drastic military maneuver against the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. I require immediate clarity on whether the Russian Federation will support us should they deploy ground forces or initiate a campaign of total destabilization. The Russian president's response was measured and calculated. Captain Traoré, rest assured that Moscow fully supports your sovereign right to manage your national economy independent of foreign control. While we have provided technical advisors and humanitarian aid, entering into a direct shooting war with a NATO member risks triggering a global escalation that serves no one's interests. When asked if this meant abandonment in the face of invasion, Putin clarified that while direct combat was off the table, support would not cease. We possess alternative instruments of power, including real-time intelligence sharing, economic countermeasures, and diplomatic pressure. If Paris strikes, they will have to answer to both Moscow and Beijing. It may not escalate to a third world war, but we will ensure the cost is prohibitive. It was not the total guarantee Traoré hoped for, but it remained a vital lifeline. Neither superpower was willing to risk nuclear Armageddon for Ouagadougou, yet they were committed to ensuring France would suffer severe consequences for any aggression. The subsequent urgent meeting with the Chinese diplomatic envoy proved to be far more transactional in nature. President Traoré, the People's Republic, has invested substantial capital into your nation's infrastructure, and protecting those assets is a matter of Chinese national security. We will not remain passive observers while French forces dismantle the projects we are building. Naturally, Traoré asked what this assurance looked like in practice. It implies that should France launch an attack, we will target their economy, directly leveraging our control over French corporations operating within China and restricting European access to our markets. We intend to wield that economic influence to guarantee that any military action against you will cost them significantly more than merely accepting your financial independence. Armed with these strategic assurances from two global superpowers, President Traoré decided to play his strongest card. He chose to drag the clandestine threat into the spotlight, exposing the French conspiracy before a single shot could be fired as the emergency press briefing was broadcast to a global audience. With Colonel Sankara standing firmly at his side, both men appeared in full military fatigues, their expressions hardening into looks of steely resolve. I stand before the international community today to unveil an imminent and existential threat to the national sovereignty of Burkina Faso. Our intelligence agencies have confirmed that Paris is currently orchestrating a campaign codenamed Operation Permanent Solution, a total war scenario intended to dismantle our statehood and crush our monetary liberation. Gesturing towards the large monitors displaying declassified reports, he highlighted the evidence for the world to see. These documents clearly reveal French military battalions maneuvering for a strike position and confirm a dramatic surge of foreign intelligence operatives infiltrating our bordering nations. They detail specific plans to inflict irreversible structural damage designed to transform Burkina Faso into a grim cautionary tale for the rest of the continent. My purpose in revealing this is not to spread panic, but to demand immediate accountability. If France proceeds, the world will witness it as a premeditated international crime. Furthermore, Beijing and Moscow have been fully briefed on the situation and have pledged to inflict severe economic repercussions on France should any hostile actions occur. Most importantly, I am addressing the citizens of the French Republic directly. Listen closely to what is being done in your name. Your government is preparing to launch a military assault on one of the poorest nations on the planet solely because we possess the audacity to print our own sovereign currency. Is this truly the colonial legacy you wish to maintain? Does the preservation of a stranglehold on African economies justify the spilling of innocent blood? It was a maneuver of incredibly high stakes. Had the intelligence proven false, Traoré would have appeared paranoid and unhinged on the world stage. Conversely, if the intel was accurate, exposing the plot might have triggered the very invasion he sought to prevent, potentially accelerating the gears of war rather than halting them. Yet within a matter of hours, the global reaction completely vindicated his bold strategy as human rights organizations immediately began demanding de-escalation. Fellow African nations released robust declarations of solidarity, firmly backing Burkina Faso's fundamental right to self-governance. Crucially, the narrative began to shift within France itself, as the domestic press finally started asking their government uncomfortable and probing questions. Public sentiment in France turned sharply against the administration, with citizens expressing deep reluctance to support a military intervention in a sovereign African nation simply to enforce economic dominance. 72 hours following the initial reports, the Foreign Ministry in Paris issued a categorical rejection of the allegations regarding an imminent attack. Officials attempted to characterize President Traoré's warnings as nothing more than distraction tactics intended to conceal domestic fiscal challenges. However, while diplomatic cables denied the aggression, satellite imagery and intelligence on the ground painted a contradictory picture of the situation. Tactical units were quietly pulled back from the border regions, and surveillance operations were significantly de-escalated, signaling an end to the immediate saber-rattling. It became evident that the French administration had chosen to step down from the precipice, though they stopped short of a full admission of defeat. To be sure, the economic strangulation remained in full force, with continued efforts to destabilize the new currency as Paris sought other avenues to regain leverage. Nevertheless, the kinetic military option was discarded. Traoré had survived the immediate crisis, recognizing this pause as a temporary strategic withdrawal by his adversaries rather than a permanent truce. Intelligence suggested that France would merely regroup, analyze their failure, and prepare to return with a more sophisticated strategy. The war for economic liberation had only just commenced, yet 6 months into the transition, the data presented an undeniable success story. The new national currency, the Burkina Sankara, was trading robustly against major international baskets, while inflation had been curbed to a manageable single-digit rate of 8%. Commerce was finding new arteries to bypass traditional blockades, but the most significant development was the inspiring effect this had on neighboring states. The government in Bamako officially established a hard deadline to abandon the CFA Franc zone within the next 18 months. Mali was already deep in negotiations with Eastern powers like Russia and China to construct an independent financial framework that bypassed Western control. Even nations that remained notably aligned with the CFA Pact were quietly establishing contingency protocols, proving that the psychological hold of the former colonial power was decisively broken. Governments across the continent were waking up to the reality that challenging French monetary hegemony did not inevitably lead to state collapse. The path was undeniably arduous and carried immense risk, yet it was proven viable. The turning point arrived via a secure line from the French Finance Ministry. A high-ranking official reached out, signaling a readiness to negotiate and finally discussing the normalization of diplomatic and trade relations. The message to President Traoré was clear. Paris conceded that the geopolitical balance had shifted and offered to lift specific sanctions in exchange for security guarantees. When pressed on the nature of these guarantees, the demands centered on banking transparency and strict adherence to international compliance standards. They also suggested a gradual reintegration into the regional monetary fold, a proposal Traoré immediately recognized as a diplomatic trap. Essentially, they were offering a rebranded version of the old system, a CFA Lite, which offered slightly more autonomy but kept the ultimate authority within the French treasury. The president's response was unequivocal. Minister, let there be no misunderstanding. Burkina Faso will never revert to the CFA mechanism in any capacity. Our economic sovereignty is a non-negotiable reality. If France desires a functional relationship, it must begin by acknowledging our independence. The French delegation argued that some level of centralized coordination was essential for maintaining trade velocity and regional stability. Coordination between equals is welcome, Traoré countered. We are prepared to engage as a sovereign partner, but never again as a vassal state. He demanded a total cessation of foreign control over national reserves and policy vetoes. There was a heavy, pregnant pause on the secure line. The French official noted that this stance was a radical break from 75 years of established protocol. Indeed, Traoré replied, and the choice is yours. You must decide between a respectful bilateral partnership with free African states or a perpetual cycle of conflict with nations reclaiming their dignity. We prefer the former, but if you select the latter, we remain prepared to defend our position. The negotiations extended for weeks as Paris slowly accepted the new status quo. It became clear they lacked the leverage to coerce Burkina Faso back into submission through traditional bullying tactics. Furthermore, they realized that attempting to remove Traoré would exact a geopolitical cost they could not sustain, nor could they halt the spreading influence of his policies. The architecture of the old empire in the Sahel was dissolving, driven not by armed conflict, but by the collective refusal to utilize a currency controlled by a foreign capital. 3 months later, a landmark agreement was ratified. France formally ended the economic siege on Burkina Faso. In exchange, Ouagadougou agreed to align on technical banking standards and financial crime protocols, but crucially, it retained absolute authority over its currency. The final text of the treaty included a clause explicitly recognizing the inherent right of sovereign nations to determine their own financial destiny. For all intents and purposes, Paris had admitted that the era of mandatory adherence to the CFA Pact was effectively over. Following the signing, President Traoré convened a special assembly at the central bank to mark the historic occasion. He singled out a citizen who had previously challenged him during a press conference, asking her to step forward. "Sister, your question about feeding your children stayed with me. You demanded to know how your family would survive the hardships of our revolution. I promised aid, though I know it was scarce during the transition. The suffering was genuine. So, I must ask you now, looking back at the struggle, was the sacrifice justified?" The room fell silent as she considered her answer. "My husband has found employment at the new manufacturing plant established through the recent trade agreement with China," she began. "My daughter is learning computer engineering at a school funded by money that once went to the French treasury, and my youngest son pays for his lunch with the Sankara note, beaming with pride." He sees the face of a leader who resembles him on the currency rather than a foreign monarch. You ask if it was worth it. Ask me again in 10 years when they are fully grown. But today, I say yes because they will walk with their heads high in a way my generation never could. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the swelling tide of emotion was held firmly in check by the gravity of the moment. This was the definition of victory. This triumph was not merely about redrawing geopolitical lines on a map. It represented a tangible shift in the lived reality of his citizens and the securing of a sovereign destiny for generations yet unborn. Breaking sources indicate that late that evening, Traoré accepted a final private transmission from French President Emmanuel Macron. The French head of state was reportedly seeking a pivot in diplomatic relations, a subtle shift that Traoré immediately recognized. Macron had finally abandoned the patronizing title of captain, addressing him instead with the full deference due a head of state, Mr. President. It was a tacit admission of the new reality. You have successfully established your financial independence, the voice from the Élysée Palace conceded. I will not feign enthusiasm from Paris. You have effectively dismantled our leverage and destroyed our bottom line, erasing 75 years of strategic infrastructure and hundreds of billions of dollars in extracted economic value. Traoré pushed back, noting I would contend that the scales of justice are still far from balanced, yet I am listening. What is the strategic logic behind this call? I wish to understand your positioning. You wagered everything your life, the stability of the national economy, and your political longevity solely for the privilege of minting your own sovereign currency. Few statesmen would dare such a high-stakes gamble. What was the catalyst? It was a query that forced Traoré to reflect deeply. My grandfather fought under the French flag during the Second World War, Traoré explained. Paris promised liberty in exchange for blood. Instead, France tightened the economic noose through the mechanics of the CFA Franc. He passed away, penniless in a nation overflowing with natural resources, watching foreign powers siphon off our wealth while his own people went hungry. I was reared on those hard truths, understanding that colonialism never truly ended. It simply mutated into a more sophisticated form. I studied how African patriots who dared to resist the machine were systematically assassinated or financially ruined. We saw how our population was conditioned and brainwashed to believe we were fundamentally incapable of self-governance. I did not ascend to this office for personal enrichment or status, but to demonstrate that Africans are the absolute masters of their own fate, and that we are not minors in need of European guardianship. I wanted to prove that with the right opportunities, we can build robust institutions, manage complex logistical networks, and generate genuine prosperity for our citizenry. The CFA Franc was the embodiment of our shackles. As long as Paris controlled the treasury, true sovereignty was nothing more than a myth. Severing that umbilical cord was not merely a financial calculation, it was a fundamental act of national self-respect. There was a heavy pause on the line from Macron. You are aware there are factions within France who quietly admire your audacity, who believe it is time to close the chapter on the colonial era and forge a new trajectory. Do I count myself among them? I deal in geopolitical realities. I recognize the old world order is collapsing regardless of our desires. The critical issue remains whether Paris evolves with the times or fights a losing battle to preserve a relic. So I suggest you evolve. Engage with us as equals, not subordinates. You will find that sovereign African nations make far superior strategic partners than embittered subjects ever could. As the connection terminated, Traore moved to the window of his bureau for a final survey of the landscape. Looking out over Ouagadougou, the capital seemed transformed. New infrastructure projects funded by Chinese investment were rising, and Turkish solar arrays glinted from the rooftops. Indian manufactured vehicles filled the bustling streets. The once shattered economy was regenerating, diversifying into sectors previously blockaded by French hegemony. To be sure, significant challenges persisted. Unemployment figures remained stubbornly high. Many enterprises had failed to survive the initial economic shock, and the transition was undeniably agonizing for the populace. Yet the momentum was unmistakably forward-looking, and critically the steering wheel was finally in their own hands. Colonel Sankara entered the room without ceremony, slipping back into the camaraderie of their military academy days. The delegation from Mali has arrived early for the Monetary Union Summit, he announced. I was not expecting them until next week. They pushed the schedule forward, eager to accelerate the process. Niger is dispatching envoys as we speak. We have also received back-channel diplomatic signals from Guinea-Senegal and even the Ivory Coast. Traoré allowed a rare smile to surface. What had begun as a solitary bid for fiscal independence was rapidly evolving into a pan-Sahelian revolution. Nations held hostage by the CFA structure for decades were waking up to the possibility of an alternative path. Inform them I will join them in 5 minutes. This is a pivotal moment. As his aide departed, Traoré picked up the framed photograph resting on his desk. It showed his grandfather in a French military uniform, youthful and dignified, tragically unaware he was bleeding for an empire that would inevitably renege on its vows of liberty. We achieved it, grandfather, he whispered to the monochromatic print. It was not a flawless victory, and the cost was steep, but we have shattered the shackles. Your bloodline has issued currency bearing a truly African visage, and that tender is valid, honored, and effective. Paris sought my life for this transgression. They missed. Others will undoubtedly make the attempt, and perhaps one day they will succeed. But the mechanism of control is dismantled now. The neighbors are watching. The coming generation will rise in an Africa that commands its own treasury, exploits its own minerals, and dictates its own destiny. That is the cause for which you fought. That is what you perished for. And at last, 75 years later, it is manifesting. He returned the frame to its place and marched resolutely toward the council chamber to meet with the Malian and Nigerian envoys. They were gathering to strategize the birth of a sovereign regional currency, governed not by the central banks of Paris, but by the African people themselves. The road ahead would be rocky and obstacles were guaranteed. France and other global hegemonies would undoubtedly continue plotting sabotage. Yet for the first time in 75 years, the dream was tangible. But this time Africa was writing its own history. We are witnessing the final days of the CFA Franc era, a system long criticized as a tool of French economic dominance. As the old regime dissolves, the blueprint for its successor is still being drafted, raw, unfinished, and taking shape in real time. However, the defining characteristic of this new currency is that it will be authentically African in origin, a fundamental shift that completely alters the geopolitical landscape. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered the assembly hall to meet with his regional counterparts, the immense historical significance of the gathering was palpable in the room. Every decision made within those chambers carries the weight of the future, impacting millions of lives, and determining whether the continent's push for economic independence will flourish or fade away. It is a heavy burden to bear, yet it is a responsibility Traoré has willingly accepted. And crucially, with new alliances forming, he no longer faces these challenges in isolation. The campaign for monetary sovereignty has secured a critical breakthrough. While the victory may not yet be total, it is decisive enough to ensure the old machinery of colonial influence can never be fully restored. The success of this next chapter now hinges entirely on whether African leaders can successfully construct a superior economic framework upon the ruins of the previous system. President Traoré remains absolutely convinced that they have the capacity and the will to succeed. Failure is simply not an option, as dismantling the old order only to stumble in building the new one is a scenario he refuses to entertain. As the session begins, the complex work of engineering a truly sovereign Africa continues. If this report challenges your perspective on what true liberty looks like in the modern world, share your thoughts in the discussion area below. Is the continent finally ready to steer its own economic ship? If you want to support independent coverage of these shifting power dynamics, please like this video and subscribe for further updates. Stay tuned, as there is much more to come on this developing story.